Hi, it's Miss Mason again, reading Counting by Sevens by Holly Goldberg Sloan, chapters 5 and 6. Del Duke. An ignoramus shoots at the wrong thing and hits it. Del Duke could not believe that he had ended up in the sprawling agricultural community. He had daydreamed bigger than this. Delwood was his mother's last name, and he'd been saddled with it as a first name at birth. But thankfully, no one had ever called him Delwood. He was Del from the start. While Del hated his first name, he took some measure of pride in Duke. Only a few relatives knew that 2 generations before, the name had been Dufinakis, but his Greek ancestor George, as far as Del was concerned, had done the right thing. Del hinted to anyone who would listen that his family had something to do with starting a university, and they had at one point worn a crown. Early on, Del Duke had wanted to be a doctor because he liked TV shows with heroic people who saved lives every day while showing off perfect teeth and great haircuts. Plus, Dr. Del Duke sounded good. It had 3 Ds, which sounded better than 2. And so Del studied biology in college, which didn't go well because he couldn't store facts. They shifted and then moved and quickly evaporated from his conscious mind. And if they were buried somewhere in his unconscious, he had no access to that area of thought. So by his second semester, he changed his major for the 4th time, moving from the hard sciences to the soft sciences. Del finally graduated on the 6.5-year plan with a degree in psychology. From there, after a lot of searching, he got a job at an assisted living center, where he was the activities director. Del was let go after only 3 months. The elderly didn't like him. He lacked true compassion, and he had no stomach for their health problems. On more than one occasion, he was seen running from the activities room in a full-blown panic. Del was too afraid to work with prison inmates, and so he has set his sights on the public school system. Del went to night classes, and after 3 more years, got a certification for adolescent counseling, and that put him on the path to work in education. But no one was hiring. Del sent out literally hundreds of resumes, and after 3 years working as a bar back, carrying tubs of used glasses to the surly dishwashers, he finally added some bogus counseling work experience to his resume and got a bite. Bakersfield. On paper, it looked incredible. The map showed that he would be in Southern California. He imagined a life full of surfboards with groups of tanned people eating medium-spiced corn chips on his seaside balcony. But the Central Valley had entire months where the temperature hit 100 degrees every single day. It was flat and dry and landlocked. Bakersfield was no Malibu. It wasn't even Fresno. Del accepted the position, packed up his barely drivable Ford, and headed south. He didn't have a going-away party when he left Walla Walla, Washington, because no one cared that he was leaving. As a counselor for the Bakersfield City School District, Del's job was to handle the difficult cases. And by that, the district meant the middle school students who got into trouble, almost exclusively for behavioral issues. These were the kids who caused enough trouble to be dealt with off-site. A typical day for Del consisted of reviewing dozens of emails filed weekly from principals. Some of the students were reported because they had turned physically violent. They were kids who targeted other kids. This meant an automatic suspension if the incident was on school grounds. You could beat up someone, but you had to make sure it wasn't in the school cafeteria or the parking lot. The sidewalk was a perfectly fine place. Other cases involved truancy. It struck Del as ironic that there were kids who didn't go to school, and they would be punished for not attending with the threat of being kicked out altogether. In addition to the violent students and the no-shows, there were the kids who did drugs and the ones who stole things. But these cases never made it in to see Del. The system took care of the young criminals on its own. Del resented that he didn't get FaceTime with the real bullies. They had a lot of personality and could be quite entertaining. It was the rest of the screw-ups who were left to counseling. There were 3 educational therapists who handled all the cases. Del was the fresh hire after Dickie Winkleman, who had served for 42 years, retired. Del had never met Dickie Winkleman, but from what he had heard, the guy was a broken man when he finally walked out the door. As the new guy on the block, Del was given the kids who the other 2 counselors didn't want. The way Del saw it, he got the losers of the losers. But Del was okay with that, because it wasn't like the students he saw would run and tell someone what a crummy job he was doing. They had already turned against the system before they arrived. Score. Dell was now in his mid-30s, and while he wasn't insightful or even thoughtful, he knew that this counseling job in Bakersfield would make or break him. But Dell had always had an issue with the organization. He couldn't throw things away because he had trouble figuring out what had value and what didn't. Plus, he liked the comfort of possessions. If he couldn't belong to something, at least something belonged to him. Looking through Dickie Winkleman's old files before the whole system had gone electronic, Dell found that Dickie had put kids in categories. It seemed that the counselor had organized the students in terms of three things: activity level, patience, ability to pay attention. Counselor Winkleman had elaborate notes and wrote painstakingly detailed reports where he made an effort to quantify his students' abilities and deficiencies. Dell was impressed and horrified. There was no way he was going to try to imitate what Winkleman had done. It looked like way too much work. Dell would have to come up with his own way of sorting through the weeds of messed up students. It only took him 3 months on the job to get the Dell Duke counseling system in shape. He placed all the kids he saw into 4 groups of the strange. First there were the misfits, then the oddballs, next were the lone wolves, and finally the weirdos. Of course, Dell wasn't supposed to give the kids any kind of classifications, but what good is an organizing system without methods of separation? Labels were important, and they were very effective. It was just too crazy to think of these kids on an individual basis. The way the Dell Duke counseling system broke it down, the misfits were the kooky kids who just couldn't help but dress different and act like fish out of water. The misfits had no power dynamic, and some of them may have been dropped as babies. The misfits, in all likelihood, were trying to fit in, but just couldn't. His next group, the oddballs, were different from the misfits, because the oddballs were more original, and usually somehow ahead of the curve. They liked being odd. The oddballs contained the artists and musicians. They had a tendency to be show-offs and eat spicy food. They were usually late, often wore the color orange, and weren't good with finances. And then there were the lone wolves. This group had the mavericks. They thought of themselves as protesters or rebels. The lone wolf was often an angry wolf, whereas a misfit was often calm and contented. And the oddballs were just out to a lunch where they had made their own sandwiches. Finally, in Dell's classification of the strange, there were the weirdos. The weirdos included the zombies, those kids who stared straight ahead and gave back nothing, no matter how hard someone tried to pry emotion out of them. The weirdos could be counted on to chew bits of their own stringy hair and fixate, non-blinking, on a dirt spot on the carpeting while a fire blazed right behind them. Weirdos were fingernail biters and liked to scratch themselves. They had secrets and were probably late to be toilet trained. The bottom line was that the weirdos were just plain weird because of their unpredictability. And in Dell's opinion, they could be dangerous. It was always best to simply let a weirdo be. Game, set, match. Because Dell's files could end up in the hands of people in higher places than his windowless room in the one half of the converted trailer on the property of the school district administration offices, he made a code for his unique system, which he thought of as FGS, which stood for the 4 Groups of the Strange. FGS broke down to 1. Misfits, 2. Oddballs, 3. Lone wolves, 4. Weirdos. He also, after much thought, color-coded his unique system. Misfits were yellow, oddballs were purple, lone wolves were green, weirdos were red. Dell then changed the font color on his personal files in his computer to correspond with his categorization. This allowed him at a glance to know what he was dealing with. The name Eddie von Snodgrass appeared on screen, and before the jumpy kid in the oversized jacket had even slid into his seat, Dell knew that he could secretly surf his computer for 42 minutes and nod his head every once in a while. Lone wolves didn't need much feedback, because they liked to rant and rave. And so while Eddie V went off on the chemical taste of soda in plastic bottles, Dell checked out a website that sold bobble-headed baseball player dolls at very affordable prices. And Dell didn't even like sports memorabilia. But the Duke counseling system was up and working, even if Dell was not. Because once a kid had been evaluated, Dell could complete the district's form in a flash, giving everyone in a specific category the same rating. Months passed. Dell kept the kids moving in and out. The trains were full of strange, ran on time. And then on the afternoon that Willow Chance came to see him, all of his categorization ground to a halt, like a fork thrown into the gears of outdated machinery. Chapter 6. I sat in the airless office trailer and stared at Mr. Del Duke. His head was very round. Most human heads are not round. Very, very few, in fact, have any real spherical quality. But this chubby bearded man with bushy eyebrows and sneaky eyes was the exception. He had thick curly hair and ruddy skin, and it looked to me as if he were at least of partial Mediterranean origin. I was very interested in the diet of those countries. The combination of olive oil, hearty vegetables, and cheese that came from goat's milk, mixed with decent servings of fish and meat, had been shown in numerous studies to promote longevity. But Mr. Del Duke did not look so healthy. In my opinion, he wasn't getting enough exercise. I saw he had a substantial belly under his loose-fitting shirt, and weight carried around the middle is more deleterious than extra pounds in the butt. Yet, culturally speaking, today men with big busts are considered less desirable than men with a potbelly, which is no doubt wrong from an evolutionary point of view. I would have liked to have taken his blood pressure. He started out by saying he didn't want to discuss my test scores, but that's all he talked about. For a long time, I didn't say a single word, and that made him talk more, about a lot of nothing. It was hot in his stuffy little office, and as I stared at him, I could see he was sweating up a storm. Even his beard was starting to look wet. He was getting more and more agitated. As he spoke, small dots of saliva lodged in the corners of his mouth. They were foamy and white. Mr. Del Duke had a large jar of jelly beans on his desk. He didn't offer me any. I don't eat candy, but I was fairly certain he did. I guessed that he had the jelly beans to make it look like he was offering kids a treat, but in actuality he never did, and went on his own jelly bean eating binges. I considered calculating how many there were in the glass container. The volume of one jelly bean equals h times pi times d over 2 times 2 equals 2 centimeters times 3, 1.5 centimeters divided by 2 over 2 equals 3.375 or 27 over 8 cubic centimeters. But jelly beans aren't really perfect cylinders. They are irregular, so this formula was not accurate. It would have been more fun for me to try to count them by sevens. I hadn't told my parents about meeting Principal Psoriasis from Sequoia, or that I would have to see some sort of school parole officer named Del Duke. I'm not sure why. It had been their idea to move schools, and I wanted them to think things were going well, or as well as possible. So now I was now officially duplicitous. It didn't feel good. The middle school years were supposed to be, according to the literature, about an emotional separation from parents. I figured lying was laying good groundwork for that. But it was as if I'd eaten something that was giving me indigestion, and that burning sensation extended beyond my stomach and moved upward, where it lodged in my neck, right where I swallowed. My parents didn't know of my test-taking drama at Sequoia because I destroyed the evidence. I erased the message from the school that was on our home phone voicemail. My parents always forgot to check it, so that wasn't a big deal. But what was more deceitful is that I hacked into my mom's email and answered the principal's note about going to see a district counselor. So I'd just have to put up with this stomach queasiness, because I deserved it. The round-head counselor warden finally stopped talking. He was worn out. He folded his short arms defensively over his ball of a belly, and then after more sweaty silence on both of our parts, he had an actual idea. I'm going to say a word, and then you say the first word that comes into your head. I'm not saying the word is a question, it's something else. Let's try to do this very quickly. He sucked in a lot of air and added, think of it as a game. Del Duke didn't know that my experience in this arena was very limited. But I have found myself to be shockingly competitive. For the first time since I stepped into the room, I felt a mild enthusiasm. He wanted to play a word game. I was certain that I could beat him in chess in fewer than 6 moves, but I have only played against a computer, and not often, because chess is one of those things that can become obsessive. I know. I once played for 20 hours straight, and experienced signs of mild psychosis. Mr. Del Duke leaned forward in his chair and dramatically said, "Chocolate." I was interested in the benefits of chocolate, and I said, "Antioxidant." He then tapped his foot like he was accelerating a car and said, "Piano." I said, "Concerto." The day before, I had heard a kid at school shout to a group of boys in the hall, "Game on!" I wanted to shout that now, but it didn't feel appropriate. Mr. Del Duke tried to write down what he and I said, but he was struggling. Finally, he gave up and decided to just play the game. He said space, I said time. He said dark, I said matter. He said big, I said bang. He said car, I said topography. He said mouse, I said wireless. He said white, I said corpuscle. He said single, I said source. He said seed, I said embryo. He said pi, I said 3.14159, 265, 979, 323, 846, 264, 338327. But I said the number very, very fast, and I stopped on the second 7, because of course that was my favorite number. Mr. Del Duke then loudly shouted, "You animal!" It scared me. I don't like loud things. I was silent for a long time, but then finally managed to find my voice. I said, "Lemur." And then his eyes grew sort of dazed for an instant, and he mumbled, "Female lemurs are in charge of the troop." This was an accurate statement. If there is conflict in the group, the female lemurs are the ones who fight it out. Because of this, the female leaders get the best food and the preferred sleeping area. I now looked at him hard. Not everyone knows that a lemur is a primate found only on the island of Madagascar. It was possible he was not the toadstool that he appeared to be. He then ran both of his hands through his curly mop of hair, and that made it double the size. This has happened to my hair before, so I understood. I left the meeting confused. I knew that he knew that I was different. Mr. Del Duke wasn't friend material because he was the wrong age, and female lemurs notwithstanding, we appeared to have absolutely nothing in common. But as I walked away from the district headquarters parking lot, I decided I would come back and see him again. Mr. Del Duke was testing me, but not in the way he thought. I believe he somehow needed me. I liked the feeling. That night at the dinner table, my mom and dad asked me how it was going at Sequoia. I said, "The experience is evolving." My parents both smiled, but their eyes were still anxious. My mom's voice was tighter than usual as she said, "Is there anyone special you've enjoyed meeting?" For the briefest moment I questioned whether they knew about the aptitude test. I took a bite of my artichoke souffle and finished chewing before answering. "I met someone who interests me." My parents perked up. This was big news for them. My mom tried not to appear too eager. "Can you tell us more?" I had to be careful here. If I didn't want a colossal stomachache, I had to use a version of the truth. This afternoon was my first encounter. Viewed as a clinical trial, I'm in phase 0, which is when microdosing takes place. I'll let you know how it develops. And then I asked to be excused from the table.